Hello, and welcome back to another awesome coffee talk. I am excited today to talk with Victoria for another coffee talk where we get to connect with our ambassadors and find out all the different things that they're doing in their classrooms and in their schools, how they're using Buncee, the different projects they've been working on, and of course, learn a little bit about their background as well for some of us who may not know who the ambassadors are. You might be surprised to find out that somebody actually lives not that far from you and you can have a Buncee meetup at some point. So Victoria, I'd like to welcome you to Coffee Talk. And I get so excited. And if you could, just give us a little bit about your background, your professional journey, anything that you want to share to let other ambassadors know about you.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in New Jersey. I'm a public of K-12 New Jersey public schools. I went to college in South Carolina. So I'm a College of Charleston graduate with a degree in elementary education in 2015 and a master's in curriculum and instruction from Western Governors University in, if I'm remembering correctly, 2017. It hasn't been that long ago, but it has been a little bit. And I used to be, of course, based in South Carolina. I taught in mostly suburban and rural public schools in South Carolina, and now I teach at an independent school in Washington State around the Seattle area. And most of my education focuses on science and math education, with the focus on, of course, how technology influences the classroom. So that's just a little bit about me and my background.
Yeah, thank you. It's always like, I always love hearing different, like I spoke to somebody the other day and just all the different roles they've had in education.
Right.
And like thinking back to where you started and maybe where you're living now or what you're doing now or what you're teaching now. I know for myself, when I graduated from college a while ago, my degree was in French, but I couldn't find a job teaching French. And so I went back and got my degree in Spanish. And I also teach STEAM, and people were like, I don't understand what the connection is. And it's like, life is about
exactly the same.
Yeah. And
degree in French. Now she teaches Spanish. She does a couple of other things.
Right. It's about having like opportunities.
Education can just be so fluid.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I like most about meeting, the ambassadors and just connecting. And it's so nice too, whenever you get to go to conferences or even just in that online space and build those relationships and find out like, just as an example, because you teaching math, I know in school, like I wish I had some of these tools that we have available to us now, because I feel like I would have done so much better. But in your role and what you do, like how much does technology play in your daily, like what you do in your classroom, in your school, that you could share with us?
Yeah, so in my classroom, it definitely plays a very large role. We actually just got course evaluations back, and one of the highlights of my course evals was the technology that I use in my classroom. I kind of get the sense that a lot of my students have not had a math experience where technology, besides like the graphing calculator or maybe like a Desmos here and there, like it just has not played a big part in their math education, which has its pros and cons. But that's kind of like a highlight for my personal journey as a teacher. I feel like my strength is using technology and education to not just streamline things and make things more meaningful for my students, but to also maybe turn like a 40-minute lesson into about a 10-minute lesson. So like instead of doing like a 5-page activity or like homework activity on quadratic functions, we'll maybe do like a pear deck or a Buncee about, okay, well, how can we actually create these transformations in quadratic functions? And that maybe takes 15 minutes instead of taking the whole 40 or maybe 45, depending on how long I have with my kids. So it's definitely been, I think, good for me in my instruction, and the feedback I'm receiving from my students has been very good as well. As a department as a whole, I know that we're working on it, particularly just because we've had a lot of just previous teachers in the past that might not necessarily see the benefits of education, which is not a bad thing. And by education, I mean like technology. So like, it's not a bad thing. They just need to figure out how to use it meaningfully in this space, because we each get a computer, which is fantastic. But we also need to make sure that we're able to use the technology appropriately. So we're all kind of working on that as a department to make sure things are streamlined, but also to make sure that as a department, we're doing things consistently and also using technologies like Buncee to a point where the kids can really get something meaningful out of it.
Yeah, and that's one thing, like just what you were saying about giving them worksheets or packets or whatever for that whole period of time. Using like Buncee when I did a lesson a few years ago on like Mexico. And I mean, there are so many ways I could have presented it, right? I could show a video, I could talk about it, I could give them papers to read, but I decided to try. I'm like, I don't know if this will work or not, but I put everything into a Buncee. I had links for them to follow, questions, and then at the end the result was that they were supposed to then create their own to answer those questions, kind of like a web quest basically. But I
Right.
can imagine that teaching something like math for students to visualize different things, shapes and everything, like being able to pull all of these things in for you as a teacher to give them a lesson where they can kind of interact with it, but also to really be able to visualize those 3D images and everything, but also to have them create too. But in your classroom, like what are
Right.
some of the ways, or is there something that you could share with us, like how you get students involved, or if you use things like Microsoft Teams or anything that you could share?
So speaking of the web quest, so actually I used to do like actual like escape rooms with my kids. That was through like manila folders because when I was doing things with just like regular, like maybe other forms or, maybe like an Excel or a spreadsheet or something like that, I found that my students at my new environment, they're just not as tech savvy, but it's because of course, a lot of the teachers in previous environments did not use the tech. So I was like, okay, we're going to go straight paper pencil. We're going to go ahead and do this through like a manila folder, old school. You do the clue, you hand it to me, I grade it, I give it back to you, here's the next clue. I found that whenever I do it with Buncee, it makes it a lot easier with the kids because they know that these are where the links are, this is what I have to do, this is my goal outcome, and they really enjoy it. And then if I could share my screen.
Yeah, that'd
For
be awesome.
yeah, of course. So I was actually on this just a little bit earlier. Okay, can you see my screen? I'm going to go all the way back.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So a lot of what I do with my students in math concerning Buncee is just making sure that they understand that data is important, and not just that data is important, but also that what the data is represented in is unfortunately sometimes just as important or even more important as the data itself. So when I was a fifth grade math and science teacher back in South Carolina, we did this activity together that was essentially just talking about ecosystems and populations. So to give you a little bit of background, I'm a little bit obsessed with the Salton Sea, which is in California. I'm now based in Washington. I've never been to the Salton Sea, but I've watched so many documentaries about it and just how it was this booming, epicenter of all of the wealth that kind of came out of the World War II, post-war era boom. But now nobody essentially takes care of it. It's now a very salty sea. There have been alternatives and efforts to save the sea, but there's no real sustainable plan. But anyway, the crux of this is essentially that the equilibrium has been thrown off. And because of that, a lot of animals and pests, really, as we would call it, are now in this place. So what we did was we put a mosquito on trial named Berry Bite, which is about as ridiculous as it sounds. And we decided to discuss together the pros and cons of the growing mosquito population kind of in and around the Salton Sea. And I use this Buncee as an example for my high school students to look at this and be like, okay, what is the data that is being represented? What is the story that is being told by the scientific method, right? And also at the same time, what is the structure? So defense speaks, right? Prosecution at this time would speak. We have deliberation period. What's the verdict? What are some closing questions that we can have? And I'll stop sharing my screen. But for them, it was definitely a wake-up call where they could look and say, okay, even if I have this great theorem or this great proof or this great anything, how do I kind of whittle down this information into this thing that's like very aesthetically pleasing for my audience, right? And then we have a conversation about what is your audience, who is your audience, how do you want to present it to them? So Buncee has definitely been great for my students in that aspect because they're realizing that sometimes, and even in the corporate world, right, data is sometimes as important as how it's being presented. And I have a lot of students that want to go into marketing or communications or biomedical science. They're already beginning to think about how their information is being displayed and communicated. And Buncee is just another great way to make sure that they understand how it's being communicated, and they really appreciate that.
Yeah. And so earlier you were talking about like the students and their response to using, like having Buncee. Were they excited, or like what was their first, whenever you first brought it
Yeah.
into your classroom?
So to be completely honest, they were kind of giving me a side eye. So because I do come from elementary and middle school education, and they knew this when I walked into the room, they kind of thought this was just some rinky-dink tool that I used to use with my elementary and middle school students. They did kind of find it kiddie at first, but then once I showed them all the different features of, creating a newsletter, and you can do this PowerPoint, or, this feature, and there's 3D models, and you can pull from the internet, they really found it to be very compelling. It definitely took a solid week or two to get them to completely turn around. But, now that we're there, they're not turning back. They don't want to look at another interface again. They're all about Buncee.
I know. Yeah. And that's like, and I would ask my students as well. And like for us, just having that space that they can create and find whatever it is they want. But it's kind of fun for me, because since they are in my classroom, and if I want to go back and just, check their progress or see if they did something, I see, they've done it for other classes. And sometimes it's those students who gave the most pushback, that were like, oh, can't we just use paper? Or can't we just use this? And they didn't really want to use the tool. But then it's funny that they've gone and they've created like 15 Buncees, but only 4 of them were for my class, and the rest were for whatever. And, so that's always fun to see.
They will do it in their spare time. They'll be like, look at this really cool thing I created. And I'll see it was created on like a Saturday at like 8 a.m.
I know.
They just love playing around with the interface, and they love it so much.
Yeah. And that's another, I guess, a good reason, we look at technology, not just for the sake of using it, but when they can use it for other reasons. And I've had parents come back and say like that they created something for work. And of course, the initial response was like, what is this? This isn't whatever tool we usually use. But then it's just so powerful just to see, that our students are teaching others and sharing the information and building their skills. Another question I wanted to ask you too is, whenever you are, like if you would create an assignment or you want to share, we have all these options available to share. What's your experience with using Microsoft Teams?
Right. So my current school, unfortunately, does not have a Teams tenant, which is a little frustrating, because in my old district, we did have one. And I'm finding like different ways to kind of share things with my students, from other platforms to maybe like a class website, like completely different. But I do find that Teams is probably like one of the best platforms I think I've used with sharing. So both corporate and my personal life, and of course also with my students, I really just find that it's a very safe, engaging space for my students to be able to share content and also comment, and of course I'm there monitoring as the adult, but just having a central hub where everything can be together is really important for me as a teacher, because if a student is maybe absent or they don't know where something is, I can point them to the right direction without having to rifle through papers. Or if a student wants to kind of do their own thing and, look by themselves, if they're able to navigate around, Teams is pretty easy to be able to figure out. And also at the same time, they're able to kind of rely on their peers to go through and look and go through comments and things. So I know in my old district, for a lot of projects that we've done, so for example, we did a property box one where it was literally like a what's in the box challenge. But if the student wanted to present something in front of the class for the what's in the box, I had them create a Buncee, but I had them share the Buncee to teams. So instead of us like sticking all of our hands inside of the box or the bag and kind of being obnoxious, and destroying their object, they would post the Buncee, they would pass the object around, and then we would have to figure out what it was, but we'd find out by posting the question to teams. And I would be the adult that was monitoring the situation. But they, of course, as the students and the scientists and the mathematicians, would ask questions about, volume or texture or taste, if it came down to that, because one student did bring a bowl full of ketchup, and that was interesting to clean up. But, we had this space where we could collaborate together. And that was really good for them, and also good for me, because I could moderate and kind of be the guide on the side instead of being the person that was constantly hovering over, making sure that everything was okay. I think that my students enjoyed the autonomy, but also enjoyed the fact that they could use technology to enhance that experience.
Well, that all sounds a lot of fun, even though a little bit messy, but learning is messy, right? But it sounds like whatever, like the things that you're doing, just giving the students that chance to kind of interact in a different way and create and do all of those things, like we know, like, and getting out of the way, which is difficult as a teacher sometimes, to be like, okay, I'm not going to stand in the front of the room, but to help them become curious. And it seems like they got more engaged in what you were doing because they were involved in working and building all those other skills too in the process.
Yeah, definitely. And they loved it. I mean, I feel like at that age, especially in 5th and 6th grade, it's kind of like that gradual release of responsibility. And I'm not a parent, but I definitely saw a lot of my students in that 5th, 6th grade age range where, you know, they're not quite ready to be away from their parents completely, but they want to do more. And they don't want the hand holding of the teacher to kind of stifle them from doing what they want to do. So me kind of facilitating that online through Teams gave them that autonomy, but also that safe space of failure. I don't know if failure is the right word, but it's the one I'm going to use. Because if they because if they were to kind of do the wrong thing, or maybe if something incorrect happened, I was still there to be the mitigator, and I could be like, okay, so this happened, what are we going to do to fix it? But they also still had that responsibility where they knew that this was on them, but if they wanted a safe adult, that I was there for them.
Yeah, no, that's not, and failure, it's a great word. I mean, we have to fail, right? Even though that's such a scary word for everybody, but that's how we learn and we keep growing. I mean, failure is learning. Yeah, no, so this has been great. Is there any advice that you would offer for, you know, anybody who's kind of hesitant to kind of get started with some of these ideas, or is maybe looking for an idea if they teach math or something and they're like, I just don't know what I could do? What is maybe something you could offer to them for advice?
Yeah, my biggest piece of advice is just kind of like how the classroom is a safe space for failure, right, for our students, where if something goes wrong, as the educator, we're there to kind of mitigate the situation. There's no unsafe space to try out technology unless you're putting your students in an unsafe environment. If you want to try out Buncee, go for it. If you want to try out Microsoft Teams, go for it. I think that the communities in both aspects, in both Buncee and Teams, are just so supportive, and there are a lot of very great resources, from the Ideas Lab in Buncee to the Microsoft Educator community. There are so many great resources where if somebody did want to get started, they could, and also have a giant support system around them to make sure that they're being successful. I think my other point that I'd like to make is that, you know, Buncee is for everybody. You know, even though my students were kind of giving me sideways looks when I brought that up in my classroom, you know, I teach at the high school level all the way up to seniors. They love it. They love the fact that they can create. They love the fact that they can make new things. They love the fact that Buncee has capabilities that just other platforms don't have. So just because you think that your students are too young, you know, or too old, always give it a try, because they're going to respond, I think, you know, very well to it. And there's a supportive community of people that are, you know, able to help you out.
I love everything you just said, especially with like the community and the support and the resources. And I think that's like the biggest piece of this is, and that's why we're doing the coffee talks as well, is to have people come in and share how they're using Buncee and, you know, what changes they're seeing in the classroom, the response of the students, and showing, like, you're right. Like, it doesn't matter if you're elementary, if you're high school, higher ed. Right. I mean, I've made birthday cards, I've made presentations for conferences. So, but you have all of these resources. And so, like, being part of the Buncee ambassadors, or just even in the whole community, whether it's on Twitter or being involved in Facebook, just sharing. And you mentioned like the Ideas Lab, the templates, like, it really is so easy to get started. And it's amazing how you just one click and it shares. It's like, I still am amazed at how that happens. But yeah, no. So thank you for joining in with this coffee talk. I'm hoping to have others sign up to do a coffee talk and share the projects they're working on. Because just like you said, the support and the resources, the more we have, the better we are. We learn and grow together. So I will catch everybody next time. Thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.